My name is Evelyn Marsh. I'm 31 years old, and I've spent the last 9 years working in emergency medicine, not as a nurse, not as a physician's assistant, as a trauma surgeon. I say that plainly because for a long time I couldn't. There were people in my life who made sure of it. On the morning of March 4th, I walked into Hargrove Medical Center in downtown Chicago wearing a gray peacoat and a hospital badge that said Visiting Clinical Reviewer, Administrative Division. No MD after my name. No department listed. Just that quiet, forgettable title designed to make people look through me instead of at me. I was counting on it. The person I was most counting on not to recognize me was already there when I arrived. My uncle, my mother's older brother, the man who had run the surgical department at Hargrove for 18 years, stood at the far end of the atrium in his white coat, shaking hands with a board member like he owned the building. Which, functionally, he did. He glanced toward the entrance when the glass doors slid open. His eyes passed over me the way eyes pass over furniture. Then he turned back to his conversation. Good. That was exactly what I needed. I should tell you something first. Something they didn't know about me when I walked through those doors. Because what happened in that atrium lobby wasn't the beginning. It was the end of a very long story I'd been writing in silence for years. My uncle was the reason I became a surgeon, not because he inspired me. Because he told me I couldn't do it. I was 22, a third-year pre-med student at Northwestern, sitting across from him at my mother's kitchen table on Thanksgiving. He'd asked what my plans were, the way powerful men ask questions they already intend to answer. I told him I wanted to specialize in trauma surgery. He set down his fork, looked at me for a moment. You don't have the temperament for it, he said. It takes a certain kind of person. Calm under pressure. Detached. You're too emotional. He said it gently, the way people say things they believe are kindness. My mother didn't say anything. My aunt changed the subject. I sat with my hands under the table and said nothing because I was 22 and he had 30 years in medicine and I didn't yet know that confidence could be a lie. People repeat until it sounds like authority. What I didn't say was that I'd already been volunteering in the ER at Northwestern Memorial for 2 years, that I'd watched my first open chest procedure at 20, that the attending afterward had pulled me aside and said, "You didn't flinch, that means something." That I had already decided, sitting in that observation gallery with blood on the floor and a heart beating under a stranger's hands, that this was the only thing I ever wanted to do. I didn't say any of that. I just smiled and passed the mashed potatoes. That was the first time. The second time came 6 years later. By then I'd finished my residency, completed a fellowship in surgical critical care at University of Chicago, and published 2 papers, one on hemorrhage control protocols, one on outcomes in pediatric trauma. I was 30, and I had been offered a position on the faculty recruitment shortlist at Hargrove. It was a serious program, one of the top 10 trauma centers in the Midwest. The kind of place that shaped careers. My uncle was the department chair. I found out 3 weeks after submitting my application that it had been redirected. Not rejected. Redirected, flagged by administration as a potential conflict of interest due to a family connection, then quietly shelved. No one called me. I received a form letter that said the position had been filled internally. A colleague who had applied the same cycle told me over coffee that the committee barely discussed external candidates at all, that the chair had suggested the pool was weak, that he had recommended they look at people already embedded in the system. I wasn't surprised. I was something worse than surprised. I was certain. Because I had seen a version of this before, and I recognized the shape of it. That's when I started asking questions, quietly. The way you do when you've learned that doors don't open when you knock loudly. They open when you find out who holds the key and why they've been hiding it. What I found took me 14 months to piece together. Hargrove had been running a surgical residency selection process that was, on paper, merit-based. In practice, it had been quietly tilted for years. Applications from candidates without institutional connections were given perfunctory reviews. 2 attending surgeons on the selection committee had personal relationships with the department chair, my uncle, that predated their positions. Interview scoring sheets for at least a dozen candidates over 3 cycles showed identical language, which suggested they weren't being written independently. And then there was the case of Dr. Yolanda Pierce. Yolanda had graduated top of her class from Johns Hopkins. She'd done her trauma fellowship at Vanderbilt. She applied to Hargrove's advanced surgical program twice, once in 2019, once in 2019, once in 2021. Both times she was told the position had gone to a more experienced candidate. Both times the candidate selected had fewer publications, lower board scores, and no fellowship training in trauma. Both times the selected candidate had been recruited through my uncle's professional network. Yolanda had filed a quiet internal grievance in 2021. The grievance had been reviewed by the hospital's equity committee, which at the time included 3 members appointed by the surgical department. The grievance was dismissed. Yolanda left Chicago. She was practicing in Memphis now, at a regional hospital half the size of Hargrove, with a salary that was an insult to her training. When I found her, I called her on a Thursday afternoon and introduced myself. There was a long silence on the other end. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I was the other person they kept out," I said, "and I'm going back in. I want to be clear about something. What I did was not revenge. At least, that's not what it felt like from the inside. Revenge is hot. What I felt was cold and deliberate, the way a diagnosis feels when you've run every test and the results are finally in front of you and you know exactly what you're dealing with. I had been asked by the Illinois Department of Public Health's Office of Healthcare Quality to serve as an independent clinical reviewer. It was a formal role, not glamorous, not visible. I would spend 4 weeks at Hargrove, embedded in administrative observation, reviewing documentation, sitting in on departmental reviews, flagging anything that didn't meet standards. The office had received an anonymous complaint about surgical program irregularities. They needed someone credentialed, independent, and willing to work quietly. They didn't know I had a personal connection to the institution. I disclosed it in my application. They said it didn't disqualify me because I wasn't reviewing the department chair directly. I was reviewing processes. I said I understood. I understood more than they knew. My badge said visiting clinical reviewer. My uncle looked through me like I was a coat rack. For the first 10 days, I said nothing to him. I sat in the back of committee meetings. I reviewed files. I made notes on paper, not digital, not stored on their servers, because I'd learned that electronic records had a way of disappearing from institutions protecting themselves. What I found was worse than I expected, and I expected a lot. The residency selection irregularities were documented. But there was something else, a pattern in surgical outcome reporting that didn't match what I was seeing in the raw case data. Certain complications were being logged under different billing codes than what the procedure notes described. It was subtle. The kind of thing you'd miss if you didn't know what you were looking for. The kind of thing that could affect accreditation. The kind of thing that could affect patient safety. I wasn't there to find that. But I found it. On the 11th day, a man in scrubs approached me in the hallway outside the records room. He was maybe 26, with the particular exhaustion of someone in their second year of residency. He stood with his back to the wall camera in a way that told me he'd thought about this approach. "You're the reviewer," he said. "I am." He didn't speak for a moment. "Then I put in a report 6 weeks ago about a procedure outcome that was logged incorrectly. My attending told me I misread the chart, but I know what I saw." I asked his name. He told me Tyler. I asked if he put anything in writing. He reached into his white coat pocket and handed me a folded sheet of paper. It was a copy of the original report he'd submitted. Date stamped, signed, his name printed clearly at the bottom. I looked at him. "How long have you been sitting on this?" "Since the day they told me to let it go," he said. His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. "I almost did. I almost convinced myself I was wrong. I took the paper. I didn't tell him who I was yet. I told him only that I was going to write his name in my notebook, that the notebook was not stored on any Hargrove system, and that if anyone tried to bury this report again, it would surface somewhere they couldn't reach." He nodded once and walked back down the hallway. I stood there for a moment with his paper in my hand. Something settled in my chest. Not satisfaction, more like recognition. The system wasn't just failing people like me, it was failing people like Tyler, who had only been in it for 2 years and had already learned to be afraid of the truth. On the 14th day, my uncle saw me for the first time. Not looked through me. Saw me. I was in the corridor outside the department chair suite, reviewing a binder of committee minutes from 2020, when he came around the corner with two attendings beside him and stopped short. His face went through several changes very quickly. Confusion, recognition, something tighter than either of those. Evelyn. He said my name like it was a piece of evidence he wasn't prepared to present. Hello, I said. The attendings glanced between us. He didn't explain. He just said, clipped and controlled, this isn't a good time for a visit. I'm not visiting, I said. I'm working. My authorization is on file with your administrative coordinator. He looked at the binder in my hands. Something shifted in his expression. He walked away. That evening, I received an email from Hargrove's legal counsel asking to schedule a meeting to discuss the scope and parameters of my review. I forwarded it to the state office and continued working. I want to tell you about what happened with Yolanda because it mattered more than anything that happened to me. I had been in contact with her throughout those 14 months of preparation. She hadn't wanted to come back to Chicago. She said it was fine, that she'd built a life in Memphis, that reopening it would cost more than it was worth. I told her I wasn't asking her to fight. I was asking her to let the documentation speak. She sent me everything: the original applications, the rejection letters, the internal grievance filing, the dismissal response. I catalogued it alongside what I'd found in the Hargrove records. The overlap was clear. Her applications had been received, they had been reviewed, and there were notes in the margins of the internal scoring sheets, handwritten notes, that used language I recognized. The same language my uncle used when he dismissed candidates in committee. Not the right culture fit. Needs more mentorship before this level. Unclear trajectory. Yolanda had the highest board scores in the 2019 applicant pool. Her trajectory had been a straight line from excellence to excellence. The notes were a fabrication dressed up as evaluation. When I delivered my formal report to the state office on day 26, I included a supplemental section on the residency selection data. It was not part of my original scope. I flagged that clearly. I also flagged that I was submitting it anyway. The day the report was received, I was asked to present a summary to the hospital's executive board. This was standard procedure. My uncle, as department chair, was present. I walked into that boardroom in the same peacoat I'd worn on day one. I sat down across from 12 people, including my uncle, who was seated to the left of the board president and who had not looked directly at me since the corridor. I presented the findings, the outcome documentation discrepancies, the billing code patterns, Tyler's report, now properly entered into the official record, and then the supplemental section. I walked through the selection data without commentary. I let the numbers speak: score differentials, publication records, the marginal notes. When I reached the slide that showed Yolanda's application alongside the notes written about it, the board president leaned forward. These notes, he said, are they authenticated? They are, I said. They were recovered from the original hard copy files in the department archive. Handwriting analysis has been completed by the state office. A woman at the far end of the table, the board's patient safety officer, a woman named Dr. Renata Osei, who I'd never met but whose work I'd read, set down her pen. I want to understand, she said, whether anyone at this table had awareness of these selection irregularities. No one answered. My uncle was looking at the table. Dr. Osei turned to me. Dr. Marsh, in your assessment, how long has this pattern been in place? I told her what the records showed: 7 years. Possibly longer, but 7 was what I could document. The room was quiet in a way that felt like reckoning. After the presentation, I stepped out into the hallway. I stood by the window that faced the parking structure and the gray winter sky above it. Tyler was at the nurse's station across the corridor, and he saw me and nodded once. I nodded back. My uncle came out of the boardroom 12 minutes later. He walked toward me and stopped with about 4 feet of space between us. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. Not diminished exactly, more like something he'd been carrying for a long time had shifted to a different position and he hadn't adjusted yet. He said, "You could have come to me." I said, "I did. Once. I was 22. He didn't respond to that. After a moment, he said, I didn't know it had gone this far. You set the conditions, I said. You don't have to know every brick to have built the wall. He looked out the window. What happens now? That's not up to me, I said. It stopped being up to me a long time ago. He nodded slowly. Then he turned and walked back toward his office without another word. That was the last real conversation we had. 3 weeks later, the hospital's board voted to launch an independent external review of the surgical department's selection and credentialing processes. My uncle took a medical leave of absence that everyone understood would be permanent. The board appointed an interim chair from outside the institution. Tyler's outcome report was reviewed, validated, and entered into the department's corrective action record. His name was noted in the official proceedings as the individual who first flagged a discrepancy. He told me later, in a stairwell, that his hands had been shaking when he heard. Yolanda was contacted by the board's Diversity and Equity Committee. They offered her a formal review of her application history and a direct invitation to reapply for a senior attending position in the trauma program. I wasn't in the room for that call, but she told me later that she sat in her car in a Memphis hospital parking lot for 40 minutes before she could drive home. I kept thinking, she said, that I'd been right the whole time, not just about my applications, about myself. I knew what she meant. I had sat in enough parking lots of my own. The state office thanked me in a letter. It was formal and appropriate and said exactly what institutional correspondence is supposed to say. I filed it. I didn't frame it. What I kept was the copy of Tyler's report, the folded paper from his coat pocket. I kept it in the back of my notebook, behind my clinical notes, behind the documentation I'd compiled over 14 months. I put it there because I wanted to remember that the thing that finally cracked this open wasn't my credentials or my access or my history with my uncle. It was a 26-year-old resident who could have let it go and didn't. I left Chicago in April. Not permanently. I had my own practice to return to, a position at a trauma center in Milwaukee that I'd held for 3 years and genuinely loved. But I drove out of the city on a Thursday morning with the windows down and the radio off, and I let myself feel what I hadn't let myself feel during all the weeks of documentation and presentation and careful professional language. I had walked into a building where my name meant nothing. I had worked in a system designed to make sure people like me stayed invisible. I had watched that same system try to do it to Yolanda, to Tyler, to however many others I didn't find, and I had not disappeared. That's the thing no one tells you about being erased. It takes energy, sustained, deliberate energy from the people doing it, which means somewhere underneath all the policy language and the procedural dismissals and the polite suggestion that you weren't quite right for the role, underneath all of it, they knew you were a threat. You were worth the effort of disappearing. I don't tell this story because I want you to be angry on my behalf. I'm not angry anymore. Anger was useful when I needed it, and I've set it down. I tell it because I've met too many people who are standing exactly where I stood at 22, nodding politely while someone with institutional authority explains to them who they are and what they're capable of. People who have swallowed the evaluation and called it truth. It isn't truth. It's a story someone else is telling because your actual story makes them uncomfortable. You are allowed to write your own. Not loudly necessarily, not with confrontation or performance or a moment designed to humiliate anyone. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is simply document everything, show up every day, and let the record speak. That's what I did. I wasn't trying to burn anything down. I was trying to make sure the right things were visible so that what was built next could be built on something real. If you're somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, if you've been redirected, overlooked, handed a form letter, told you weren't the right fit, I want you to hear this. Keep the paper, write down the date, find the others who were told the same thing. You don't need their validation to know what you're worth. You needed it once, when you were young and didn't know yet how to trust yourself, but you've been through enough now. You know. The record is yours. Start writing it. Wherever you're watching from tonight. Whether it's early morning with coffee, or late and you can't sleep, and you needed to hear someone say something true, I'm glad you're here. If this story found you, I hope it found the right part of you. The part that has been waiting for permission to stop doubting yourself. You don't need permission, you never did. Walk forward. I've thought a lot about what actually caused everything that happened in that boardroom. Not the presentation, not the documents, not even the 7 years of selection records laid out on a conference table for 12 people to read in silence. What caused it was a choice, made years earlier in a direction nobody saw. My uncle didn't lose his position because I came back for him. He lost it because he spent years making decisions that treated people as inconveniences instead of as professionals with something real to offer. Yolanda's applications didn't disappear because she wasn't qualified. They disappeared because someone decided that keeping the system comfortable mattered more than keeping it honest. And systems built on that kind of decision don't hold forever. They accumulate pressure the way old pipes do, quietly, invisibly, until one day something small gives way and you realize the whole structure has been compromised for longer than anyone wanted to admit. Tyler was that small thing. A second-year resident with a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket and enough integrity left to hand it to a stranger. He almost didn't. He told me he'd spent weeks talking himself out of it, telling himself he must have misread the chart, that his attending probably knew better, that being right wasn't worth the cost. I understand that feeling completely. I spent years doing a version of the same thing, filing away the Thanksgiving table comment, filing away the rejection letter, telling myself maybe he was right, maybe I wasn't ready, maybe I was reading into it. That's what unchecked authority does to people. It doesn't just block them from opportunities. It gets inside them and starts borrowing their own voice to do it. What I learned from Evelyn, from myself, I suppose, is that intelligence without honesty is just strategy, and strategy without ethics eventually collapses under its own weight. My uncle was intelligent. He understood institutional systems. He knew how to build alliances. He knew how to make his preferences look like policy. But he wasn't honest. And over 18 years, that gap between his intelligence and his integrity became the thing that undid him. Not because I exposed it, because it was always going to surface. These things do. And what I learned from Yolanda is something I want to hold on to for the rest of my career. Being right about yourself is not the same as being recognized. She was right about herself the whole time. She knew her scores. She knew her training. She knew exactly what those rejection letters were. And she carried that knowledge alone in Memphis for years, practicing excellent medicine in a building that was too small for what she was capable of. That's its own kind of endurance. Quiet, unglamorous, and genuinely hard. Resilience doesn't look like what we think it looks like. It doesn't always look like fighting back or making a scene or confronting the person who wronged you. Sometimes it looks like Yolanda, showing up every day to a job that underutilizes you, refusing to let someone else's assessment of your worth become your own. That's the harder form of it. And it matters. If you've been told by a relative, a supervisor, a system, a form letter, that you're not quite right for where you're trying to go, I want you to hear what I actually believe. They were measuring you against what they needed, not against what you are. Those are different things. Keep the documentation, trust the record you've actually built, and find the Tylers, the ones who are also sitting on something true and just need to know someone else is paying attention. That's what changes things, not confrontation, not timing, just people deciding, one at a time, to stop letting the truth stay folded in their pockets.